we know the Bible's true?
First, the very nature of revelation is not just propositional. It is embodied. It is incarnated. But let's go to the propositional side because the question was raised, and I think your question is a very critical one. On this peg hangs just about everything the Christian believes. It is this. It's a fellow was once doing his PhD dissertation, and he disagreed with the way dissertations were judged. So he would say things like this. He would make some profound statement and say, as told to me by the waiter on Fifth Avenue's restaurant. And then he would make another statement, as told to me by the elevator boy in such and such a place. And they were all verbal references to somebody he talked to. So the professor looked at him and said, you can't make statements like this in a dissertation. You have to have written references or footnotes. And he said, aha, why? Why do you have to have it as written? Why is it more important because it's written rather than the waiter telling me in a restaurant or the elevator man telling me? So the professor said, okay, that's all right. Just wanted to see where you're coming from. On the day he was graduating, he said, we have passed you and given you your PhD, but we're not going to give it to you in writing. Just take my word for it. There's something about the inscripturation process that is very important because truth is primarily a property of propositions. When you look at the Bible, it is a very distinctive book. Unlike Buddha's teachings, which are the sermons of Buddha, or the Quran, which is the utterance of one man and the compilation of it posthumously, this takes 66 books from about the mid-1400s all the way to the first century. And you've got this 39 in the Old Testament, 27 in the New, and you've got a single thread going through all of this. The collusion factor would have had to be incredible to bring this about. For example, you go back to the prophecy of Isaiah, writing 700 before Christ, to talk about the virgin birth, to talk about Micah talking about the city where he would be born, and Zacharias talking about the way that the Messiah would ultimately be crucified. You take these writers, some of whom were not contemporaries, and you put all the converging line of evidence. You take the hundreds of those prophecies and bring them into the person of Jesus Christ. It would have taken an extraordinary stroke of genius to retroactively bring all of that to the convergence in one single person. Now, the authority of Christ hangs on the resurrection. If those who wanted to disprove the authority of Christ, they could have done it in one simple stroke. And if Christ were a charlatan, he could have done it in one simple statement. You know what he could have said? I will rise again spiritually. You would never have been able to falsify that statement. Because after he died, you'd have said the body is there. He said, yeah, but he said he would rise spiritually. That's not what Jesus said. Jesus said he would rise again bodily. Which means if the body of Christ had been presented, his entire authority would have been decimated. The resurrection factor became key in the retroactive authentication of the Old Testament. Virtually every book of the Old Testament was quoted by him, I think, with the exception possibly of the book of Esther or so. But you've got the books of the major prophets, the minor prophets, the Pentateuch and so on, authoritatively quoted. Now you take all of that and bring it into the point of testing. You first have to say this, how do I know it is not true? You would have to give a series of contradictions or historically false statements to say this is unacceptable here. That is a simpler way. You could just say, look, it says this is such and such a city so many miles away from here. They'd never existed. And what did exist was 100 kilometers from there. You could begin to falsify it very quickly if there was such falsification possible. After 2,000 years of Christ's incarnation, 3,500 years since the inscripturation process, I want to say this to you. No book has been more studied. No book has been more scrutinized. And of all the places of studies, Princeton, which is hardly a bastion of conservatism today. Dr. Bruce Metzger, possibly the greatest New Testament scholar in recent memory in America, and F.F. Bruce, the greatest New Testament scholar in England of recent memory from Manchester, have both arrived at the same conclusion, that the documents and the authority of the Bible totally reliable. In fact, Metzger went so far as to say 99.4% of what we have in the Bible today has been corroborated along as you go back across time with the extant copies available early in history. Let me close with this little illustration. I was speaking in Albania a couple of years ago, and I'd finished speaking to the parliament, and there was a gentleman in audience there, and he came to me and he said, "I want to give you a treat today. Will you come with me? I'm the curator of the museum here in Tirana, the biggest museum in Albania. As you know, we're an atheistic country." I said, "Yeah." He said, "I want to give you a treat." I said, "I'm really kind of tied up." He said, "You will regret if you don't accept this invitation." So we arrived there, police guards, military, all of them guarding the building. We said, something odd is going on here. Why are we here? But we came in. He walked me into a big room full of people. He said, "This is my staff. I want you to speak to them and tell them what you told the members of parliament today." I said, "I thought you told me this was going to be a treat." He said, "After you've spoken to them." So I came to this museum, finished my talk. Bob and I are sitting at the table. The doors swing open. The guards come in with books. They're wearing gloves in their hands, and they place the book in front of me. He says, "This is St. Chrysostom's translation of the New Testament from the 400s, excavated here in Albania in the 900s. I said, "This is Chrysostom's?" "Yeah." "In gold ink." It was so perfectly justified you'd think a computer had done it. It was opened to me on Matthew chapter 26. They gave us gloves as we looked at it. Matthew 26 tells the story of the woman with the alabaster ointment, a woman of ill repute, who had walked in and washed the feet of Jesus, and the Pharisees were offended. And Jesus said to them, "I have a question for you. You're looking at me so disparagingly, and you're looking at her disparagingly because of her lifestyle. I want to ask you a question. If two people were in debt, one owed 50 and another 100, and both were forgiven, who would love more?" The Pharisee answered, "The one who was forgiven more." He said, "You're looking at her. And wherever this gospel is preached, there shall also this story be told of what this woman has done to me." 1600 years after Chrysostom's translation, I was reading that story, which he wrote 400 years after the event. Ladies and gentlemen, no book has been scrutinized as much as the Bible has. The Quran has never allowed itself to be scrutinized that way. You take the scriptures and find out if there's any blatant contradiction you find again and again. You will not see it. His birth, life, death, and resurrection, all prophesied in the Old Testament, all came to pass in the 3 short years of that earthly ministry, and of course prior to that in his birth. Jesus said, "The scriptures cannot be broken. Thy word is truth." He put it in writing. You can test it out. You don't have to take the elevator boy's word for it. Check the writing against history, and you'll find it to be true.